joining the webinar. As I said, coming to you from the other side of the Atlantic, but really the focus here is on what's going on in the UK, particularly as people who joined the webinar. This is all about the deep dive into the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that's probably a continuing spectrum. I have to say, this is something that is still being implemented as we speak. There are maybe one or two, if we can call them, further deadlines ahead, particularly I think in April. We'll get to that when some of the agri-food rules come into full effect. But it's very much a sort of where are we now, looking at it from a multiplicity of perspectives. I would just briefly, I'm not going to do a very long bio because that's not what we're here for, but just briefly in what we think is going to be the speaking order today, Aidan Connolly, who is the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium. Hi, Aidan. Who's going to sort of do a really sort of good overview, I think, of the protocol, where we're at. And then we're going to pass on to Frankie Devlin, who is the head of KPMG's Indirect Tax Services in Northern Ireland. Hi, Frankie. I will do that for each one. And then we're going to be joined shortly by Dr. Anna Drzewiecka, who's not with us just at the moment. Anna is the founder of Trade and Borders, and also is a sort of a long-time customs consultancy expert who also provides services to the Chambers of Commerce in Great Britain and the UK. And then briefly on to Declan Billington. Hi, Declan. Declan is the chief exec of Thompsons and Sons, which is a agri-food animal feed manufacturing firm. And then finally, last but not least, certainly on to Pete McSwiney, who is the who is the chair of not only ASM Limited, which is one of the leading providers of customs clearance related sort of software, but also chairs the trade and industry side of the Joint Customs Consultative Committee, which is a working group with HMRC that looks at customs matters. I'm not here to speak much longer beyond that, simply to say that all the people here, for those of you who don't know, have all sat in various forums at one time with myself on different working groups throughout this Brexit process. We are now into the end game, really, of detail. And that's what we're here to do, is to really have a practical deep dive into what some of the issues that businesses should be looking and are grappling with at the moment. Maybe one or two housekeeping rules, just to say that we have had some questions come in. We'll try and pick them up in some broader detail. Please do leave your questions in the chat. Each speaker is going to speak for about sort of 7 to 10 minutes. I think one person does have slides as well, and I will try and pick your questions up in the Q&A afterwards. Please do, everyone, if you're not already, go on mute and maybe if off camera just for the time being. Without any further ado, just before I pass over to Aidan, just to say we will be, this session is being recorded just for reference, and I look forward to picking up some of your questions in the chat. So off we go. Over to you, Aidan.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your attention today and your interest. I'm going to quickly rattle through where we've got to at the moment with the protocol. What was decided on the 8th of December, what was decided with the TCA, how that affects us, some of the problems, and then what else we need to be doing. So you will know that on the 8th of December, there was another command paper. Sorry, that was the 10th of December. The command paper was brought out on the 8th of December. Vice President Sefcovic and Michael Gove agreed some derogations for Northern Ireland. The main one was the UK trader scheme, which meant that 98% of traders would not face tariffs under the new regime. However, that thunder was slightly stolen whenever the zero quota, zero tariff FTA was brought in. What is important, though, from that 8th of December agreement was the derogation on export health certificates. And those export health certificates are not needed now until the 1st of April. However, they are very costly. We will need vets, and it does lay an extra layer of complication and of friction. And of course, as I say every time I'm on one of these webinars, friction means cost. The other derogation is for that P&R list, that is the prohibited and restricted list. And those are things that do not have an export health certificate or won't have after the 1st of July. And therefore you will not be able to bring them in from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Those are things like sausages, mincemeat, prepared meats, breaded poultry, and very much things that you would find in your local supermarkets. Now, there are those who are calling for complete reorientation of the supply chain. There are others who would like to see this derogation on PNR widened out. What we're doing as the Northern Ireland Business Brexit Working Group is to look at what solutions that we can find that, as we try and do, leaves no part of industry behind. We then had the TCA. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Suffice to say that it didn't really do too much for Northern Ireland. We had hoped that it would have something in it about SPS, about sanitary and phytosanitary agreements, veterinary agreements. It didn't have anything. But what it did do, and I think perhaps this is the most important part, it does provide a framework. And a framework is a good word for it, because you can pin other things onto it. It is a starting point for perhaps a future closer relationship. The example that I always give is Switzerland. Switzerland has 210 pieces of legislation or of agreement between itself and the EU to get to where they are now. So I like to think that, especially as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, we have these derogations in place. We have the Northern Ireland Protocol, we have the TCA, but hopefully we will be able to get more added to it. There have been a lot of teething problems with the new customs regime. Quite simply, we've never had to have this from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. There are 40,000 products in your average supermarket. Each of those needs a custom code inputted in. So you're talking about time, man hours, new systems. And we have seen some empty shelves in Northern Ireland. Now, that's not just to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol, because we have seen it in Great Britain as well. That is to do with a perfect storm. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it has actually been a perfect storm for us. There has been a lack of preparation, or perhaps a lack of understanding of what the end of the transition meant for some suppliers, so they weren't au fait with those new procedures. It's a fundamental change in how we do business. We usually would bring in these sort of changes in a year, 18 months. We had a few weeks to get ready. The big thing was the EU to GB COVID sort of breakdown, that fact that we couldn't get that fresh food in. That really did have a knock-on effect in Northern Ireland. And then, of course, we in Northern Ireland are going through a very tight lockdown at the moment. And that means that some people have been overbuying things. For example, on mince, we're up about 30% on people buying mince as to what they would usually do this time of year. But I think it's really important to correct the narrative that there are food shortages. There are not food shortages. There are a few hundred products out of 40-odd thousand that are missing. So there are choice issues, but there's not food shortages as such. What we've been doing as the Northern Ireland Business Brexit Working Group, we have continued to engage. We've met with the Northern Ireland Executive. We've met with Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. We met with the Irish Revenue and Customs and the Department of Foreign Affairs yesterday, looking at simplifications that can be made there on things like the 24-hour notification period. We would like to see it using the same exemption within the AKI, which allows just in time to be 8 or 4 hours notification. So we'll continue. I think we were called the Oliver Twist of business, because every time we get something from the EU or from the government, we turn around and say, that's great. Now, what more can you give us? And that's where we will continue to be, quite simply because we are facing 2 new cliff edges. That's on April the 1st as far as EHCs, export health certificates, are concerned, but also the 1st of July when we're talking about that PNR, that prohibited and restricted list. We did see, it's in the papers this morning, that the CEOs of the major retailers, the grocery retailers, wrote to Michael Gove to ask for the setting up of a group to look at solutions, unique solutions for the unique problems of Northern Ireland. They've also asked for time to implement those new changes. We will continue to ask for that. We will, of course, make the best of what we have, but at the same time, trying to make these major changes as to how we trade with Great Britain is really, it's nigh on impossible in the time frame that we've been given. We'll continue to work away on those issues, but we will need some more understanding from the EU and from the UK government. Lastly, from me, because I do want to make sure that you have time for questions. Lastly, from me is Article 16. In the same way as during last year, everyone was going, well, GATS 24, GATT Article 24 is going to be the magic wand that solves everything. There are people that are saying Article 16 and Annex 7 is the magic wand that is going to settle everything. Quite simply, those people who are putting forward Article 16 are very fond of Clause 1, not so much of Clause 2. Clause 1 is where it sets out that one side can take unilateral action if there are certain requirements fulfilled. But Clause 2 sets out that the other side can take reciprocal arrangements. And for us, that's really important because we still need to use the Port of Dublin. We still need that the EU to accept that none of the goods are at risk as far as tariffs are concerned. And all that really does become at risk again if Article 16 is brought in. Secondly, these are not problems just for Northern Ireland. We've seen Great Britain's having supply problems as well. So it doesn't fit in to that parameter as well of invoking Article 16. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the majority of these things are teething problems. And to invoke Article 16 now, what it does then is throw everything up in the air, and the EU and the UK will have those very long, protracted negotiations on the way forward, whereas we do still need to give a bit of time for these to embed while looking at solutions that not only work for Northern Ireland business to keep us competitive, but allow us to give choice and affordability to Northern Ireland households. You got to remember, Northern Ireland households have half of the discretionary income of Great British households, and that's one of the reasons why we continue to work so hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. Yes, Northern Ireland is always in a special, some might say invidious, we'll see, to yet to be determined position, but certainly I think at the apex of this, really ongoing living process. It's just worth saying that, there are not only, I think, extra work for the Joint Committee to keep working on the protocol, but also under all the committees that have been introduced under the aegis of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and the UK. So very much the starting point, we hope, rather than the end point. I'm now going to pass to Frankie from KPMG, who's going to walk us through indirect tax and VAT and has some slides. And I will, by the way, for everyone, we've been given some links to put into some webinars that actually even Irish Revenue are looking at hosting potentially, and also a helpline. So we'll leave those in the chat. But Frankie, over to you.
Thank you, Ali, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I've just got, I think, 8 to 10 minutes here, so I can really just cover this in very brief detail. There are a lot of changes on VAT. And again, a lot of these changes came very late in the day. A lot of the focus was obviously on the customs issues and not so much on the VAT, but obviously there were always going to be VAT changes. And if there was going to be a sea border, a customs border on the island of Ireland, or sorry, not on the island of Ireland, in the Irish Sea, then there was always going to be a VAT border that would have to go with that. So I suppose wherever you've got a customs border, you're always going to have a VAT implication. So just quickly picking up some of the general points in the protocol. In terms of the general rules, obviously Northern Ireland will remain in the UK VAT area, and that VAT system will be operated by HMRC as it has always been done. However, the VAT rules relating to goods will follow the EU VAT rules, so the principal VAT directive in the EU will also have to be followed. In terms of the UK legislation, there is quite a lot of new legislation on VAT. In our VAT Act 1994, there's a number of new schedules and statutory instruments, a lot of which relate to Northern Ireland. Some of the changes obviously relate to the rest of the UK as well, but predominantly a lot of these legislative changes relate to Northern Ireland and its relationship with the EU. In terms of the VAT return, in Northern Ireland, businesses will continue to use a normal VAT return that they've always done and the VAT number that they've got. will still apply. Important to remember that the protocol does not apply to services. So again, Northern Ireland will follow the rest of the UK whenever they're dealing in services. So it's only in relation to trading in goods with the EU countries that these rules will be different for Northern Ireland. And again, in terms of the electronic VAT refund system, where Northern Ireland businesses or businesses that are operating in goods in relation to Northern Ireland, if they incur VAT in another member state, Northern Ireland businesses will continue to have access to the EU system in relation to that. So again, Northern Ireland in general terms will be sort of part of both the EU VAT system, but also the UK VAT system, and it will be governed and policed by HMRC. So if we could have the next slide, please, Chelsea. So again, I mean, this is just a map of the island of Ireland. And again, you know, the whole issue around the protocol was to try and make sure that there wasn't a hard border on the island of Ireland. So effectively, therefore, the trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will continue pretty much as it has always done. And therefore, all the rules that we have had in the past will continue. They've been carried over effectively. So what that means is whenever we're trading between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, again, a VAT number, if it's provided by, say, a Republic of Ireland customer to a Northern Ireland supplier, that will be a zero-rated inter-community supply, and the same thing will apply in reverse to that. The XI prefix, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, and again, there's been quite a lot of confusion between the XI VAT prefix and the XI IoD number, which are two different things. The XI VAT prefix is relevant where there's a trade in goods between Northern Ireland and another member state, or the other way around. And in that case, it's important that Northern Ireland suppliers use their XI prefix on their VAT invoices to make those supplies. Again, with distance sales across the island of Ireland, and again from Northern Ireland to other member states, that will continue as it has always done. So again, that's where you're supplying goods to non-VAT registered customers. So Northern Ireland will continue to follow those rules of the EU. And again, in terms of statistical reporting for EC sales and Intrastat, again, Northern Ireland will have to comply fully with that, whereas the rest of the UK largely doesn't follow that, apart from in the first 12 months for arrivals into the UK. And again, I'll reference Notice 725, which is an important VAT notice, which deals with a lot of these issues. So again, if you're looking for changes in information regarding EU supplies relating to Northern Ireland, that's probably your go-to place. Next slide, please, Chelsea. So again, a lot of the discussion and problems and concerns have been with regards to trade between GB and Northern Ireland and the other way around. And obviously we're well versed in the customs issues and the declarations and now the rules of origin implications around all of that. So again, in relation to VAT, again, there is effectively what I would call a VAT border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And again, effectively, when goods move between GB and Northern Ireland and the other way around, it is effectively an export and import of goods. However, to try and keep the rules as much as possible the way they were, HMRC in implementing that rule have decided to effectively treat the import VAT that arises on import as if it is output tax, so supply VAT. So again, from a VAT reporting point of view, if the goods are just moving between Northern Ireland and GB or the other way around, the VAT reporting is quite similar. There are some complications around movements in VAT groups and things like that, which do give rise to different reporting obligations. And again, if you're using special customs procedures to move goods, like a customs warehouse, again, there will be a different VAT reporting obligation around that. And again, I think it's important to sort of be familiar with the customs implications around all of that. I suppose what I would say is it's really difficult, or it will be really difficult, just to think about VAT in isolation or customs in isolation. The two things really go hand in hand from here on in whenever you're moving goods across a customs border. So next slide, please, Chelsea. Just quickly on this one, this is just dealing with rest of world imports into Northern Ireland. So again, there are some changes here. Again, for those imports into Northern Ireland, similar to the rest of the UK, postponed import VAT accounting will apply. So that's in relation to rest of world imports, but not imports from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. So postponed import VAT accounting is probably something which you will want to make sure you're getting your freight forwarder to opt for on your customs import declaration, to make sure that you can get the cash flow benefit of that and not have to pay VAT and then recover it, so you can deal with it on your VAT return that way. Importantly, you need to have an XI-EORI number if you're importing goods into Northern Ireland or exporting goods from Northern Ireland. And again, likewise, if you're moving goods from GB into Northern Ireland, on that customs import declaration, an XI-EORI number is required on that. And then there are some changes with regards to B2C supplies for Northern Ireland, where the goods are being imported from rest of world. But again, the rules are similar to the rest of the UK as well. So again, for consignments which don't exceed £135 in value, the overseas seller, or if it's been sold online through an online marketplace, they will be responsible for accounting for the output tax effectively. If the value is below over £135, in that case, then it's the normal rules that we've always had, that import VAT does arise and the consumer will be responsible for that. But that's the same across the whole of the UK in that case. And then the low value consignment relief has been removed across the UK. So again, that has given rise to some issues around mail order and things like that. And then the next slide, which is the final slide that I just wanted to talk to. So again, I mentioned at the start that the protocol doesn't deal with services, only goods. So that means is Northern Ireland will follow the normal UK VAT rules that the rest of the UK will follow for supplies and services. So again, it's this sort of dual system, which is a little bit confusing. And obviously businesses need to make sure that their systems and their ERP systems are configured properly to deal with that. But largely for services and VAT, the rules are, they're not going to change dramatically across the UK, but there's a couple of watch outs probably for around the use and enjoyment rules, which are quite complicated because the UK is now effectively a rest of world country. Effectively, it means that use and enjoyment rules will displace the place of supply in certain cases. So an example might be if you're a UK supplier of equipment to a Republic of Ireland business customer, from here on in, that will mean that UK VAT would be chargeable on that if the use and enjoyment of that equipment is in the UK, whereas previously that would have been just dealt with as a no UK VAT and reverse charge by the customer in the Republic of Ireland. So there is a change there. There is also some changes around B2C, business consumer services, in relation to things like accountancy and legal services. So again, previously UK VAT would be chargeable in those cases from a UK supplier, but again, because the UK is now a rest of world country, effectively, it will mean that if I'm a GB or UK supplier of services, accounting services to a private buyer of those services based in Dublin, for example, previously I would have charged UK VAT on that, but here on in, that would be outside the scope of UK VAT and no VAT in Ireland as well. So that's actually quite positive. And then the final point I wanted to mention is for the financial services industry, there is quite a significant change in relation to probably their VAT recovery position if they're supplying financial services to non-UK customers. That will, from 1 January, mean that the VAT recovery position should actually improve significantly for any non-UK financial services that you provide. So if you're a bank or a financial institution that's involved in that, that's probably something to look at in terms of your partial exemption recovery position. So again, just to sum up, the rules are complicated. They always were complicated. This has added extra complexity, I suppose, on top of all the other changes on customs rules and rules of origin. So again, it's a lot for businesses to get their head around, but I suppose I would say on the VAT that businesses are very adaptable, and I think fairly quickly they'll get up to speed on these changes and make sure their systems are working compliantly. Okay, so I'll leave it there, Ali. Thank you.
Thanks, Frankie. And as you can imagine, in addition to all the other speakers, the services of Frankie and our next speaker between customs and VAT are in great demand at the moment. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Anna Zaleska, who is the founder of tradeandborders.com and also a long-time sort of customs expert in this field. I know that there have been some questions in the chat we might pick up sort of potentially separately around re-export and or transit, but I know rules of origin or country of origin is something that's been cropping up quite a fair bit, even if there is, as I think she's going to mention, this sort of effective grace period to some extent. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Ali, and thanks for having me. The Irish sea border ended up being UK's test border, where all these provisions, all these formalities are in effect being tested, because it's the first border, UK's border, whereby this is being implemented as of the 1st of January, as the other two speakers mentioned. And one thing that really doesn't make this any simpler, especially for people like myself, like Frankie and Aidan as well, who are advising companies and helping companies to deal with that, is the lack of the border operating model, the lack of comprehensive border operating model for that particular border, which is something that we were told is going to happen, and then for various reasons didn't end up happening. But that makes it slightly difficult because we don't actually necessarily have clarity. As Frankie mentioned, these rules are incredibly complicated, and without proper guidance, it makes it slightly challenging, both for advisors as well as obviously for companies and hauliers and service providers. So to give you an example, one of the questions that myself and Ali actually as well has been trying to get to the bottom of for the last several months, I think actually it was almost 3 months, was the question of IORI numbers. And perhaps maybe to add to what Frankie said, we've now finally got some clarity from HMRC to say that when you're actually importing into an I, you need the XI number, which is EU IORI number, which is EU's IORI number, as well as a GB IORI number. You actually need them both, because some systems will only take GB IORI numbers, and some systems will only take the XI EU IORI number. And that's something that we have been asking about for several months. We are now the 13th of January. We have a bit of clarity now, and the guidance is well, coming at some point. But you can imagine, and this is just one example, so you can imagine how challenging it is when you're trading under circumstances where you're not necessarily sure, and you don't really have anyone to ask. And again, to add to what Frank was saying, he was mentioned VAT and customs and how closely connected these two are, and that's absolutely the case. On the customs side, one of the areas that has been causing quite a lot of difficulties are rules of origin. And even when we talk about the other borders and the deal, but when we talk about the Irish sea border in particular, it's one of those issues that really hasn't been mentioned much by the government before the deal was signed or before the end of the transition period. And in a way, I don't really know why that was the case, why we were focusing so much on the zero tariff, zero quota part of the deal, but not on the conditions that come with that, meaning rules of origin. But unfortunately, just because you don't talk about problems doesn't mean that they actually go away. And now we are in a situation where companies are very quickly becoming aware of rules of origin. And many of them, basically hardly any of them are ready for rules of origin, because companies when they were preparing, even the ones that tried to prepare for the end of the transition period, they were preparing for customs declarations, formalities, SPS checks, and so on. Rules of origin were always the last point, because we weren't sure whether we're going to get a deal or not. So now that we have the deal and rules of origin, and again, the previous speakers mentioned that the deal doesn't really do much for the protocol and for the Irish sea border, it actually makes things slightly more complicated, because despite the fact that we have the protocol and that there are other arrangements for that particular border, rules of origin do actually come into play. And the first way in which they are relevant is the sequencing of determining whether goods are subject to tariffs under the protocol and under the TCA when the goods cross to Northern Ireland. And again, here we don't necessarily have perhaps as much guidance as we would like, but the general principle is that we first determine whether goods are subject to at-risk categories, so whether they are excluded from the at-risk categories, so whether they are destined for the NI market, whether it's whether we're confident that they're going to stay in that market. And then if we cannot determine that the goods are not at risk, then the next step is to see whether they meet good rules of origin and avoid tariffs in that way, even though in some cases it might actually be easier to certify origin than it is to determine that the goods are not at risk. So this is another gray area where we're trying to kind of establish, could you perhaps just start with that if you don't necessarily want to go the route of determining whether goods are at risk or not at risk. The second area, or the second example of how rules of origin made things slightly more complicated is minimal processing or transshipping. And this is something that has been in the news recently over the last week quite a lot, or actually even 2 weeks, is this idea that, again, a number of companies were under the impression that if they bring goods into the UK under the New Deal, repackage, split bulk consignments, keep them for a little bit, they can then move the goods forward or kind of forward them to Northern Ireland and then to the Republic of Ireland. That unfortunately is not the case under rules of origin. There's a list of what's called minimal processing or minimal operations or insufficient processing, or however you want to call it. It's basically a requirement that for goods to, on the way back to the EU, so when the goods enter NI with the risk that they might enter the Republic, for these goods not to be subject to tariffs, some substantial processing has to be done in the UK, actually in GB, for these goods to acquire GB origin. It's a bit counterintuitive because these goods came into GB while being of EU origin and came under the deal. However, they lose originating status when they enter GB, and when they're staying in GB, they lose that status. So on the way back, they're still subject to tariffs. So that is at the moment causing havoc with various supply chains, especially food and drink industry, textile industry, and a couple of other industries as well. We've seen in different EU agreements, we've seen in CETA, the EU agreement with Canada, there are ways to work around it. We haven't included the same type of language in the TCA. We'll see whether this will be addressed at a later stage or not. But at the moment, the situation is that goods cannot be transshipped, which obviously impacts NI supply chains and impacts the rest of our Republic supply chains. And then the last point I'm going to mention on the rules of origin is just the fact that, again, that hasn't really been made that clear by HMRC, but that's something that the European Commission has been quite clear. And by quite clear, I mean it was in the footnote in one of the guidances that we got a couple months ago, is the status of goods produced in an NI when it comes to EU origin. Are goods produced in an NI eligible for preferential origin under EU trade agreements? And here, unfortunately, the answer is not. They're not eligible. They're not counted towards EU origin, meaning that if a company in the Republic uses inputs from NI, it has to be particularly careful to make sure that that it still meets rules of origin if it then wants to send goods, for example, to Switzerland under the Pan-European Med regional accumulation. And I've actually had clients, Swiss clients, that were impacted by that. They purchased something from NI and used the Pan-European Med accumulation. And unfortunately for them, as of the 1st of January, that means the difference between not paying any tariffs and paying some tariffs. And there will be a number of companies that will be impacted both on the NI side because they might start losing business, on the Republic side because they need to find different suppliers, and as well as companies within the PEM region and European companies that will have their supply chains affected. So rules of origin are one of these areas that we're now starting to think about. We're starting to see the impact on supply chains, and we're starting to understand how little experience companies have with rules of origin. We have that simplification in a way. So we have two simplifications. One is on the GB side, is part of these 6 months of simplifications and easements, whereby if you don't submit a customs declaration for 6 months, you obviously don't claim origin at the same time, because you claim origin, preferential origin on a customs declaration. So when you defer submitting a customs declaration, you also defer claiming preferential origin. So that's one simplification for importers into GB. However, that won't help anyone on or importing into NI. There's another derogation or simplification whereby you don't necessarily need to have a supplier's declaration at the time of import. A supplier's declaration is a confirmation. So if you're not the manufacturer of the product, but you're purchasing product for someone else, from somewhere else, from a different company, they provide a supplier's declaration to confirm that their products meet rules of origin, and then you as an exporter can use that declaration. Now with this derogation, that there is no requirement to have it at the time of import, but it's obviously still good to have it retrospectively at some point, because there is obviously still a requirement to keep the paperwork. But again, this doesn't necessarily change much. It's just a bit of a simplification in terms of supporting documents. And I'll stop here. I'm confident there'll be quite a few questions on rules of origin and customs, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I know that was a whistle-stop tour. There's quite a lot to get through. And I'm sure in maybe some small part, our next speaker, Declan, will touch on some of that. Just by way of brief introduction, and I know he doesn't like the limelight too much, but our next speaker, who also is an MBE, by the way, I forgot to add the introduction at the beginning. Declan is probably the most model business you could find. He's been on top of the theory and the practicality since day one for his own animal feed firm in Belfast, which, if anyone's been to Belfast, it's pretty hard to miss. I actually now understand what someone means when they said that there's a certain smell of grain that I actually quite like that. It's quite an incredible place to walk around if you're ever in the neighborhood, so to speak. So Declan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ali, for that. We've listened to the previous speakers describe the complications, but the nature of business is to get on with making it all work. And what I want to do is share with you practical experiences that may help you navigate the challenges by learning off the experiences of the last 2 weeks of both my own business, but also colleagues in the industry as they navigate this. So the disclaimer at the start is I'm going to share practical experiences and give you pointers that might help. But when you finally decide how you're going to engage in this, always make sure you have the right expert advice to keep you right. My job is to point, not to be the consultant on this. I think we need to bear in mind that the outworking of the protocol and the free trade agreement is a work in progress. We were in the single market for what, about 20 years. We've been out of it for 2 weeks. Would we be surprised that we have teething problems in the first 2 weeks? I don't think so. But we are identifying the problems, dealing with them, and moving on. What I want to do is focus on some principles. I'll give you 1 or 2 case studies because a worked example is always much better than the theory, to highlight the things you need to think about. And I'm pitching this presentation at sellers to Northern Ireland and buyers from Northern Ireland in the hope that this conversation will help you find the path of least resistance to do all of that. Current state of play, it's all bedding down. Interestingly, there were many challenges in the first week or so, but hauliers who were well prepared for this have now got both the customs and SPS procedures into Northern Ireland working very well. So one of the practicalities of this, if you want to trade into Northern Ireland, is find yourself a haulier who has already had his 2-week baptism, and he will know the practical ways of working the system. What I want to talk about is briefly what's going on with physical movements and how you might choose your path of least resistance. The customs bear traps to watch for, and Anna's already touched on some of them. And looking at some of the easements that you can work to your advantage, and also point out that there's still some solutions outstanding from the UK government that will come in later and may provide additional facilitations. So looking at NI to GB, moving goods from NI to GB, there are no issues. It's flowing very smoothly. Going indirectly, however, via Dublin Holyhead is complicated because you're having to export from a European port into the UK. The platform the UK have developed, the trader support system, can help handle declarations that will give you a smooth passage into GB from Holyhead. But the truth is, most businesses in Northern Ireland are avoiding the Dublin route. They're waiting for someone else to figure out how to make it work simply and easily. And once they have the answer, they'll copy it. And generally, it'll be the hauliers who will learn the way to work the system. So in the last couple of weeks, you will find that goods have not really been moving NI, Dublin, Holyhead, because nobody feels really comfortable with the systems needed to do it. It can be done, but it's difficult. So let's take the easy path, the unfettered access from Belfast and Larne into the United Kingdom. And I would say again that hauliers have been testing all aspects of all systems, and they're the first point of call I would work with in trying to figure out how to move goods GB to NI, because they already have the knowledge and insights that can help you. So just going on, moving on to the free trade agreement, we have the extra complication of a free trade agreement and rules of origin, but also overlaid by a protocol. And the key thing to bear in mind is if goods coming from GB to NI meet the rules of origin, there's zero tariff on them. There's no risk to them, and they can move into Northern Ireland and from Northern Ireland into the rest of Europe. However, everything that comes from GB does not necessarily meet the rules of origin. And again, Anna touched on them. The bear traps that businesses are finding at the moment are distributors bringing goods in from Europe, decanting them, putting them through groupage or whatever, and shipping them to Northern Ireland. And the problem here, you'd say it's a European good, how can it face a European tariff? And the answer is this thing about insufficient processing that is covered in the protocol, that you can't actually bring goods in from Europe, not touch them and send them back. And that's tripping up a number of businesses that are basically distributors into Northern Ireland. So watch out for that. The second issue is special set of rules to determine whether goods originate in the UK. Very good case example on that is flour coming from GB factories into Northern Ireland that we bake the loaves and the cakes that supply Northern Ireland. The way it sits at the moment, if a Northern Ireland flour miller wants to make flour, he can buy in Canadian wheat, which is an essential ingredient for both the quality and colour of the flour. And generally the inclusion rate is more than 15%. So he can buy it in, checks the European tariff. It's a preferential rate. So although we don't have access to export FTAs in Europe, we actually benefit from the preferential rates in Europe when we're doing the comparison of tariffs. So no tariff on the European because there's a preferential rate for Canada, no tariff on the UK because there's a free trade agreement with Canada. So the business can bring the flour in from a third country, no tariffs, the wheat, make the flour, make the bread, and away we go. No issues in distributing that bread across Europe. An English business taking the same flour in under the UK's free trade agreement with Canada makes flour. The problem is that flour fails the origin test because it has more than 15% non-originating materials. In other words, more than 15% of the ingredients are not UK or not European. And as a result, when it comes to Northern Ireland, it is an at-risk good. It doesn't, and therefore a tariff will be triggered, and it'll be the European MFN tariff because this product has no origin now. And then you have to say, right, it's coming in, how do I deal with that? And there are a number of facilitations that say, well, actually, if you're going to use that flour to bake bread for consumption in Northern Ireland, provided you make promises at the point of import that that's all you're going to do with it, then there will be no duties charged, but you may be audited in due course. So I'm giving you an example. Ignore the fact that it's Canadian wheat or flour. The principle is that when you think a good coming from GB to NI is okay, you got to check the rules. Generally, wholly obtained has an allowance of 15% for food products. Other products are based on value. Be careful that you understand the origin before you ship it. There are a number of facilitations that exist in Northern Ireland for businesses, but the key point is that those facilitations to waive the duties, if the goods in theory should be subject to European duties, require the importer to be resident in Northern Ireland. And if, for example, the importer is bringing in food for sale to the final consumer, and it's to UK supermarkets, this is applicable, or corner shops, generally that you would claim the relief as an importer of food for final consumer. But you got to make sure your books and records will show subsequently, if you're ever audited, that actually the goods did go to a retailer in Northern Ireland. And if you can't prove that, you may subsequently face a claim for the duty. Moving on, I suppose, a couple of things to bear in mind. I said you had to be resident in Northern Ireland. That actually means that if your business has a presence in Northern Ireland and meets the requirements for a residence in Northern Ireland, you make them the importer, and then they can also apply for all these easements. The problem with the protocol at the start is a lot of businesses sell, particularly deliver duty paid, DDP, and that creates a problem. They don't have a presence in Northern Ireland. So there's actually an easement at the moment that says, okay, for the first couple of months, if you're an English business, for example, or a Scottish or Welsh business selling to Northern Ireland and you don't have a physical presence, provided you're sure your customers do, you can make use of this easement. But after a couple of months, it'll disappear, and therefore you end up having to create your own presence or change your contract terms to Ex Works or SIF. But your contract clearly states the importer is responsible for handling the import, because only the importer can get the reliefs. There's another angle to play short term, and that is that if you're selling to Northern Ireland and you're worried about duties and things like that, but your customers are small or SMEs, there's a rule that basically says that goods sold to businesses in Northern Ireland with less than £500,000 of turnover are automatically exempt from the goods they're buying being at risk. So again, if you're a business selling to lots of small businesses whose turnover is less than £500,000, whilst they need to be registered on the system, the TSS system, be the importer, there is no problem with duty because they're so small, there's an exception for them. Larger customers tend to buy, and they, if they're, for example, a flour baking company, if you're a bakery baking bread and you buy in that flour I said is a problem, you can actually promise that you'll only use it to bake bread in Northern Ireland. You don't pay the duty, and away you go. You bake and sell the bread to retailers in Northern Ireland or back in England, no problem. One thing is you need to be registered for these schemes. It's an active exercise of A, being registered, and B, when the goods are imported, you make a claim that the goods are not at risk. Interestingly enough, you have automatic and provisional registration the moment you apply. And if 4 months from now they find that you actually didn't meet the criteria, you cannot continue to use those schemes going forward. But you're not penalized, I'm told, for the fact that you did use the schemes for the first 3 to 4 months. So it's a common sense thing to get registered as onto this risk waiver scheme as an importer. And that buys you time to settle down all the problems whilst you use the declaration it's not at risk. And if it turns out after the event you didn't qualify, there's no retrospection, I'm told, but you buy yourself time to get your supply chain right, that you will be eligible in later months. For the future, things need to bear in mind. There are some short-term facilitations for supermarkets. They don't need to worry about export health certificates. For other businesses, food processing businesses, they do need them, but there is a general blanket one that is generated, so things get ramped up within 3 to 4 months to being a little more challenging. That stuff that I mentioned to you about you don't need to be present in Northern Ireland for the first couple of months is an easement that will disappear quite quickly, but you should bag the opportunity to solve your problems in the short term by using it. And I suppose the outstanding points in all of this, one question that's been asked by a business, look, I buy stuff in and I waive the duty and that's fine, but I do trade some of my business into the Republic of Ireland, so the goods are at risk. What do I do? There's not a huge amount of clarity about it. The belief is you have to pay the duty and subsequently make a claim for rebate. So a month later, you're able to prove how much of your goods were consumed in Northern Ireland and how much were exported to the rest of Europe. And you say, please, sir, 90% of the duty I paid related to goods consumed in Northern Ireland, give me my money back. That's a rebate system that is promised in the protocol, but has not been implemented yet. And therefore, it is an outstanding point, and it's hard to plan your business model on the basis of a rebate system you haven't seen. So you should build your business models on waiving the duty at the outset. Also, the whole Dublin Holyhead, there's work going on to simplify the declarations and movements. There's discussions between the UK and the Irish governments, and the technical people are looking at how to create what's called a simplified transit movement for it all. But as I said, it's the more complicated way of moving goods to GB. And for the meantime, a lot of people will just stick with NI direct to the GB ports. That's really it for me. The message I would give is people are still learning, but put a toe in the water. What a number of businesses did in the first week was they sent a single lorry across. They learned what they got wrong and they fixed it for the next lorry. And when that worked, then they just turned it on full and continued to trade the way they normally did into Northern Ireland once they were sure they could handle the system. And the other thing is, when you're booking your transactions on the TSS system, what I'm hearing is, yeah, book the customs paperwork on, but leave the haulier to handle the declarations around the physical movements of the lorries, because they may change trailers, they may change trucks, they may change ports, they may change sailing times. So get a good logistics / haulage company that you work with. You may handle the customs inputs onto the TSS system, but your haulier will want the flexibility of managing when he moves those goods. And that's it for me, Ali.
Thank you so much, Declan. As ever, a very pragmatic look. I think every time I've ever seen Declan speaking, it's always, these are the challenges, how do we deal with them? Here are the potential opportunities down the road. So always a very even-handed look. And I know that sort of, particularly for transit, which our next speaker might pick up in part, transit and sort of multi-groupage issues have been sort of being worked out as we speak, but obviously we might pick up the access to EU and UK FTAs issue in a bit more detail in the Q&A. So without any further ado, our last but not least, by no means least speaker, Pete McSwiney, over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Ali. I just wanted to give you a sort of overview from the customs point of view, as we see it as a supplier of software. We weren't really aware of the Northern Ireland Protocol until late on in the year, and the main problem with it was the use of CDS, the new customs clearance system that replaced Chief. Now, earlier on in the year, we'd had a number of meetings with the software suppliers, HMRC, and the community systems providers, and we sort of worked out that there was really little chance of CDS being deployed, and Chief could be turned off much before the end of 2021. Now, at that time, HMRC were very keen to turn off Chief in March of 2021, with the last entry being put into Chief in September 2020. But that was it was accepted after a number of meetings that was impossible. So then we were faced at very short notice with the requirement to deploy CDS live into Northern Ireland. Now, that was never going to happen. The system itself wasn't ready. There were changes being made and substantial changes to CDS being made in December still, and the trader had no chance to test it and see whether it worked. So as a result, we were lobbying for Chief to be continued, which has worked to some extent. So you can use Chief for the rest of the world entries, but not from goods coming from GB. So the current situation with CDS is that there are, I believe, 5 software houses that have got some functionality, but I'm not sure they've got any users, or at least a handful of users. And the TSS came about. Now, the TSS, again, was supposed to use CDS, but in actual fact, at this point in time, it hasn't made any frontier declarations on CDS, instead of which they've gone for the entry in declarants records, which is a simplification of the CFSP, Customs Freight Simplified Procedure process. And their first real engagement with CDS is going to be on the 4th working day of February, when they put the supplementary declarations in, which are required under the CFSP processes. And it will be interesting to see how it works. At the moment, we're not sure. So that's CDS. With our sort of advice to our users when we were looking at customs generally, what should you do, was to use transit. Because transit, from the point of view of an intermediary, should be anyway a fairly straightforward way of moving goods. But there have been some difficulties with the system. We've had, speaking from ASM's point of view, we've had some issues with the standing data in our software. We've had the odd bug or two, which we've fixed as we've gone along, but it hasn't been helped by the fact that there's no test system for transit. So any changes that HMRC make are done on the live system, and when they put them in, you don't always know what the impact is. So we've had situations in common with a lot of people, and our users have had the same experience, where they put an entry in, doesn't get accepted. They put it in again a couple of hours later, which is not recommended process, but people get fed up when they haven't had a response, and then it suddenly goes through. We've had problems with shipments being discharged perfectly fine on one day, and the following day, when they've had the similar shipments with the same data, it won't accept it. It throws an error for some reason. So those are still ongoing, and customs are reluctant to admit the fact they've got any problems with their system. But we're working through that. The problem with actual entries and people's ability of doing the entries, I mean, speaking from ourselves, it's difficult to get any new processes in place, because we're being inundated with questions. How do I do this? How do I do that? And the same thing is the case with most of our customers in Northern Ireland, who are predominantly intermediaries. They are absolutely snowed under by people asking them, how do I do this? How do I do that? And it makes it very difficult to actually get on with the job. They haven't worked out the processes, how they work, and it's becoming a big problem. Personally, it's just an opinion. It strikes me that even if you count all of the capability on CDS, even throw in the chief capability and the TSS, I don't think there's enough capacity within Northern Ireland to actually handle the number of declarations that are going to be required. So that's just my view. As an effort to try and sort of ease that, Customs have introduced an easement for the express carriers, and the express carriers have got a sort of an entry holiday until the end of March for goods that are carried by an express carrier in excess of £135 of value. Now, quite what they're going to do for entries after the 31st of March, I'm not sure, because the trade body that represents fast parcels, ACES, is pretty unanimously agreed that they can't be ready for CDS by that time. And I think it's going to be a problem for the rest of the industry. There are there's just too much of a learning curve. You know, CDS is a very complicated system. It uses different data sets than Chief, and people don't understand it and they're not equipped to it. So I've got the feeling that there will have to be some other reason for the way we're working at the moment, or we face a major problem, I think, by mid-year. Just looking at the questions, Sonia Novak's got a question which says, what procedures will be applicable for goods arriving from GB to NI but transiting through the port of Dublin, which has been answered, but I can't see the answer. So I'll answer it and probably give a different answer to whatever the previous answer was. But basically, if you're shipping goods from Northern Ireland through the Republic to GB, you should, I suppose, technically start a transit movement in Northern Ireland. It travels to Dublin Port under transit. Now, they then have a couple of choices. They can move it under transit to GB, and the transit can get discharged in GB, and the goods are of Northern Ireland origin, they just should be released into free circulation without any problems. Although technically how you do that is proving to be difficult if you look at the examples from goods from Europe being discharged from transit. It's not well understood. The other alternative is that Dublin Port can discharge transit, but they would have to be satisfied that the goods are of Northern Ireland origin, not other origin goods which happen to be shipped from Northern Ireland. So it's difficult to see how they would do it. These processes are not in place between hauliers, ports, ferry operators, and people don't understand what they have to do to satisfy themselves that they're doing it properly, or actually what they have to do to put the things in place to make it work. So I think that's all the transit questions that I've seen on there. And I hope that's given you a sort of a flavour of where we're at, really. I don't think there's been many, there's not been much I've said that's going to be particularly helpful for you. In all of these things, it raises more questions than answers. But as Declan said, you know, we're trying it and trying to work it out as we go. And I think that's all we can do. So we'll just carry on.
Thanks, Pete. But before I open it up to other questions to other people, and I think there's some interesting news that I've just seen Aidan tweeting about on VAT and secondhand cars, which actually I got quite a few questions on. It's not just sort of some isolated incident. But Pete, just before I hand back to some of the others on questions, you know, that February 4th date, I wonder if you could just talk it through just really briefly about, you know, is this just for people who are using TSS? Do you think that it would be helpful to try and, in the absence of understanding why it's been brought forward to February 4th, helpful to have the system give enough time to basically extend that any further?
I don't think they can, Ali, because the law says on CFSP, if you're doing, you know, a deferred declaration, unlike the UK, who has a 6-month system, they can you know, defer the entry for. Under the UCC, the entry has to be put in on the 4th working day of the following month. So I think a lot of people that are using TSS aren't aware of this, and they think they've done it. You know, they've made a declaration, the goods have come into the country, they've got them, and then they're being asked for more data so that this supplementary declaration can be made. But I think it's going to be a problem working out who's responsible for it, because the TSS is using entry in declarant's record, not using a frontier declaration. You've got a spoofy ORI number to get the entry through the safety and security system. So I don't think, I might be wrong about this because we're all learning as we go, But as I understand it, the TSS are not using the EORI number of the importer. So quite how they're going to work out who's responsible for the subdeck, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, and this is probably why there's a mix of people using the TSS and also just entered intermediaries and freight forwarders and so on. Thanks, Pete. Just a quick question. I think it was addressed to Anna, but I might also pass after Anna to anyone else, perhaps Declan, who might want to pick it up on the use or inability or ability, it remains to be seen, of Irish companies to use Northern Irish supplies, component parts, in order to take advantage of EU FTAs or preferences. Anna, I might just pass back to you and then maybe on to Declan to pick that one up in a bit more detail.
Yes, sorry, I muted myself. So what I was mentioning was the question. There was the question whether components and inputs from NI qualify as EU originating, and this is one of these things where we've been asking, various trade and customs people have been asking for clarification for longer than I care to remember, and we didn't really get anything. And then at some point, the EU customs and preferential origin guidance came out, and there's I'll just read it out. It's on page 9. There's a footnote number 20, and it just says, for the purpose of this section on preferential origin aspects, Northern Ireland content, as the content of the rest of the UK, is to be considered as non-originating after the end of the transition period, which this one footnote tells us that goods need to be, the goods produced and inputs and goods manufactured in NI do not count as originating for the purpose of EU trade agreement. Obviously, if you use these parts and components from Northern Ireland, bring the goods into the Republic or anywhere else in the EU, and you manage to undertake substantial processing and you meet rules of origin in other ways, that's absolutely fine. It's just that the content, NI content, cannot be counted towards EU content based on that footnote. I've not seen anything else from the UK government. I've not seen anything else from the Commission. That's what we have at the moment.
Thanks. And Declan, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to pick up there, but I know that this question bedeviled people for a long time about, were Northern Ireland businesses going to have access to both EU and UK FTAs, certainly in terms of import preferences, to what extent that really depended on the EU doing it on a case-by-case basis with respect to Northern Ireland. But if there's anything there you might want to pick up.
Yeah, just for the general audience, Northern Ireland goods have unfettered access to the European single market. That's 450 million people. But if one of those European companies incorporates the Northern Ireland good for sale to third countries where there's trade agreements, South, Korea, that sort of thing, it can't count towards European origin. A very good example of that is Northern Ireland dairy farmers sell their milk to Irish milk processors who make infant formula and sold around the world. But because they're using Northern Ireland milk, then the infant formula does not qualify under a European FTA. So we can send our milk south to make butter sold into Europe, but we can't send our milk south to make infant formula to be exported around the world. So that's the point of difference there. Free access to Europe, but no one will want to buy the Northern Ireland product if they plan onward export around the world. On the preferences and trade agreements, Europe were very clear, because we're part of the UK customs territory, European trade agreements therefore do not cover Northern Ireland. But when you're looking at imports, type in your tariff code and go to uk.gov and ask what the tariff, go to the tariff code website, and you will find a set of tariff codes and duties for goods in Northern Ireland. It's the European rates, and you will see that we apply the European tariff code, including the European preferences on imports. So Canada, I gave was a very good example. In theory, the MFN tariff on wheat is about £79 a tonne, but the European tariff code on wheat from Canadian origin is 0 because of the preference. So when you ask yourself, what's the duty in Northern Ireland, you first of all look at the European you go into the UK Gov website, it'll tell you what the duty is from that origin. It's 0, and you go, good, European is 0. Then you go into the UK one and say, what is it under the UK preference with Canada? It's 0, and away you go. So whilst we don't have access to the trade agreements for imports, we benefit from the tariff rate the rest of Europe apply from that origin. That effectively means we do not measure against European MFN. We take advantage of the preferences on imports to determine what the rate is that we pay. It's a higher of Europe or UK, but Europe is often 0 because we benefit from those FTAs.
And just briefly, I know there's also a question I might ping to Anna, and maybe back to you, Declan or Aidan, about we haven't even used the word Incoterms yet, because obviously we've been trading within the UK, so it hasn't exactly been needed. Just two questions. One, I know, for example, it's probably more relevant to your firm than others because of the wheat from Ukraine, but have you noticed any particular changes on some of the existing preferential agreements we had through the EU on rollovers, so to speak, whether it's on quota or access? Have you noticed any changes that you think people would be worth looking at? And then secondly, I just maybe casting a longer shadow to some extent, or a longer horizon. You know, obviously at the moment things are, I wouldn't say simple with the protocol, but certainly a little bit more simpler because we're sort of in a standing position on respective FTAs. Just thinking about, for example, even with the US ongoing negotiation, how you might see that evolving in terms of keeping an eye on both sets of changes under as EU and UK FTAs probably start to diverge. I wonder if there's anything in either of those that you might want to pick up, or heaven forbid, maybe even project in the future.
Who do you want to go first?
Declan, sorry, I'll start with you, just because I know you're in the mix to a certain extent on some of these issues.
Okay, the TSS system has a schedule of different types of contracts under Incoterms that start with Ex Works and end up with delivered duty paid, DDP. In order to benefit from the easements and the ability to avoid duty by declaring your goods not at risk, the only businesses that can do that are the importers if they're resident in Northern Ireland. So one of the questions is, do we move our sales to Ex Works? Well, you could move your sales to Ex Works, GB to NI. You could move them to free on board. You could move them to SIF. So there's a number of types of changes under the Incoterms you can make, and it still leaves the buyer the ability to make use of these reliefs. So it's not Ex Works, which means come and collect from my door. If you used to deliver, you can still deliver, provided you're very clear the terms that you use that ensures the importer is the buyer resident in Northern Ireland, because only then do you trigger those benefits. So that's the Incoterms, and you'll find a schedule of that on the Trader Support Service. In terms of FTAs and issues there, we stood away from buying any other origins in the products that I bought around the world until I was clear about the FTAs. We still have an issue, although we have access to European preferences, we don't have access to European quotas, which effectively means Northern Ireland has a unique problem. We would be buying product under a European quota from Russia and Ukraine. UK will have quota, global quota that could be used, but the problem is you buy under UK quota, it arrives in Northern Ireland, it's an at-risk good, and it isn't a preference you can use. You need a European quota, and they're not available to us. We have a problem there, but also we have opportunities. So for example, goods that are customs cleared into anywhere in Europe are in free circulation, and they can come to Northern Ireland. So that means third country goods that maybe were brought in under quota in Europe can come to Northern Ireland and be processed in Northern Ireland, whereas they would fail the origin test if they were coming to GB. So what I say is manage the bear traps for now and then go and look for the opportunities. And there are opportunities simply because there's a set of different rules. They create problems, but they create opportunities. So in that example, there are goods circulating in Europe that will fail the origin test going into GB, but because they're in free circulation in Europe, and if they're moved directly from Europe into Northern Ireland, then no tariffs arise for bringing them in, but they would arise if the same goods moved directly into GB.
Okay. And Anna, just on the Incoterms, I'm just wondering if you're finding that people are asking these questions now about, or you're advising people to put these into sort of Incoterms contract provisions, and just on a I had a couple of questions recently asking about kind of, everyone's heard about, let's say, AEO, and there was the sort of authorized economic operator provisions, and there was an agreement between the EU and the UK to have some mutual recognition. But obviously, AEO isn't necessarily the sort of silver bullet or even relevant in every case to some of these in terms of easements and facilitations. I know that it's been mentioned already, X works. We haven't really talked about IPR, inward or outward process relief, or even sort of CFSP in terms of how you move the goods. So I'm just wondering how you're sort of working with clients on talking about sort of which easements might be relevant to them in a protocol context at all.
Yes, so on Incoterms, getting them included in the contract is obviously very important. However, what's even more important than that is making sure that both parties understand what this Incoterm means. So where exactly does the title of goods pass from one part to the other, where the risk and legal liability and insurance, where that change kind of takes place, where that transits from one party to the other. One thing that we've noticed in the run-up to January.
We might have lost Anna there.
I'm here.
Briefly paused.
Carry on. Can you hear me?
Carry on, Anna. Okay. Sorry, might be my end.
Freaking me out. So one thing we've noticed in the run-up to January is that companies were incredibly reluctant to speak to their suppliers, clients, and so on, and discuss this Incoterms. So this is incredibly important to get these agreed, because without that you can't really proceed. You don't know where the responsibilities, you don't know who needs to do what. On AEO, again, it provides benefits in terms of quicker clearance, potentially some simplifications or benefits if you're applying for other authorizations under the customs legislation. Again, I don't personally see how that if you're stuck in a line, you're in a queue, you're stuck in a queue, and I'm not necessarily sure how AEO will help you here for now. Perhaps later on this will change, and we'll see how it develops. This, transit, if it works, that's one of the ways to deal at the moment. We've not really seen that much interest in terms of new companies in IPR or other customs procedures, special procedures yet, because customers are at the moment just trying to understand how the normal import and export process looks like. I'm just going to very quickly mention one thing on rollover agreements, because that's something I have seen with my clients, is that this question around minimal processing is also relevant for rollover agreements, for the continuity agreements. A lot of clients think that because they've heard that under these continuity agreements, there's this additional type of accumulation, the third-party accumulation, whereby inputs from the EU are included in UK origin when their goods are exported to, let's say, Iceland, Korea, or other of the countries where we have rollover agreements. However, this question of minimal processing is still important. So whenever you're bringing goods into UK and all you do is repackaging them or relabeling or something like that, it's still relevant, and it is necessary to check the exact wording of that rollover agreement, because it's not necessarily the case that they will be originating.
Great. Thanks very much. Never will I ever accuse anyone else's internet stable connection being unstable. It was my own. And then I just wanted to pass over to Aidan first, and then maybe Frankie, because I know there have been, as is always the case, live updates as we speak. I think there's been some good news, one around VAT for secondhand cars, I meant, in terms of trying to avoid sort of it being effectively charged twice for a second time, and also some promised mitigations on groupage. And I just wonder if maybe you could briefly talk us through that, Aidan, on both counts, before I turn over to Frankie to see what he makes of it on a practical basis.
Okay, so the update is that on VAT there has been an agreement reached on that extra VAT that would have been as far as car dealers concerned. So that's really good news, not just for car dealers, but for consumers in Northern Ireland. And Frankie can go into more detail in that. On the groupage thing, and both of these issues are things that the Northern Ireland Business Brexit Working Group, which the IoD Northern Ireland is part of, have been pushing for quite a while. On the groupage, we started looking at different solutions. It looked like that one wasn't going to come, and then at the start of this week, sitting down with logistics and sitting down with other people from DARA and DEFRA. It looks like we have now got a groupage method, which will be either shrouds or shrink wrapping of individual sealed containers. So should they be pallets or whatever, that can then be moved on to lorries, and each of those sealed pallets or however big they are will then feed into the CHED, and that means that they can actually look after the smaller suppliers who are so reliant on those on groupage to move things to Northern Ireland. So great result.
On we go. On we go. Thanks very much. But just before I come to Frankie, because I'm wondering if Peter, maybe you wanted to jump in on the back of the latterly point raised there. I might come to Pete, if that's okay, briefly, just to pick up a point there you might have wanted to make. Pete has his hand up, but he's off camera and muted at the moment.
I'm trying to get off mute.
There you go.
So I think I've succeeded. No, so I wanted to just say there's been a publication, an email put out this morning from the JCCC about some of the common problems with transit. So I was going to send that to you, and you could circulate it around to the meeting, and also to mention that on our website we update it regularly, so people can keep an eye on that and get to grips with what the actual daily issues are. So I'll forward that to you.
Thanks very much. And yeah, it's I first came across the JCCC online. Actually, you'd be amazed how much, at least at the beginning, they were putting up, and hopefully now that we have an agreement, there's a flow of it going forward as well from HMRCs. And Frankie, I just wanted to come to you on and just a brief, I'm about sort of a 5-minute warning. So if all panelists could, giving you enough notice, I think just maybe a final closing thought, parting thought for people who are on this webinar thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much more things to consider now that I hadn't, but also there are ways around this and workarounds as well. But Frankie, I wonder if you might just pick up the VAT issue, not only I think from the consumers aspect in Northern Ireland on secondhand cars, why it was an issue, but also maybe just widely, more generally, to ask, so many of the questions around VAT are going to be so company specific, but I wonder if there are any kind of general collations by topic. What are the things that you're being asked most, I think, around what the VAT implications are? There may or may not be different perspectives, whether you're on the NI or GB side of the Irish Sea. But Frankie.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Yeah, I mean, that would be very good news on the margin scheme. I mean, just firstly, why it was an issue. It sort of brings home the point about whenever goods are moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, they really are moving from effectively a rest of world country as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, and those goods are moving into the single market effectively. So because of the way the margin scheme for secondhand goods works, those cars that dealers would buy from Great Britain to come into Northern Ireland for sale, the margin scheme under the EU rules wouldn't have applied, in the same way that a Great Britain car moving into any EU member state, the margin scheme under EU rules wouldn't apply. So effectively, the EU VAT rules were being applied to Northern Ireland in exactly the same way as they would apply to any other EU country. So on the one hand, it made logical sense from a legislative point of view, but from a practical point of view, given that Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and given that a huge stock of cars that are sold under the second-hand scheme in Northern Ireland are sourced from GB. So it was a major problem, because it would have effectively meant that the price of a second-hand car was effectively going to be as costly as a new car, which obviously wasn't going to work for consumers here or for dealers. It would have just decimated that industry. So delighted if a solution has been found. It'll be interesting just to see what the solution is, and obviously we'll want that in writing and to be absolutely clear that it does work. In terms of maybe broader issues quickly that we're dealing with, a lot of the VAT issues are sort of interacting with the customs issues, and there's a lot of confusion, I suppose. So it's back to the point again, in terms of setting up your systems, doing your invoicing. What are the VAT implications? What are the customs implications? What way am I moving these goods? Is there a better way to move the goods? So in some cases, the answer is quite straightforward, to do something maybe slightly different, to tweak your supply chain slightly. And in other cases, there may be an actual additional cost, which is unfortunately a consequence of Brexit in some of these cases. So very wide ranging, but I would say to anybody that's dealing with VAT within a business, don't look at it in isolation. Look at the customs implications. Are those goods moving across a new customs border? That wasn't the case before. If it is, there's going to be additional customs implications and rules of origin implications, which obviously the panel have talked about. Really, really important to think about it in a much broader way. So both as advisors on our side and businesses, we're all going to have to sort of expand our sort of brief in looking at all of these issues.
Great, thanks. And I think that's actually a good sort of final thought for you to close on. So don't worry, I won't come back to you separately. And then just I might briefly come just for a rounding sort of closing out thought first to maybe Declan's always got many of them and is a voice of pragmatism on one of these things. So Declan, if I could come to you first for your final kind of closing thoughts about you know, there's still mileage and miles to go, but you know, we are learning as we go to the same extent.
I just think anyone that has trade with Northern Ireland, putting your toe in the water, taking that first step is going to be concerning because the world has changed, but a lot of trade is still flowing and flowing quite effectively. So cut your teeth on your first transaction, take it simply, prove out that it works, get comfortable with it, and then just ramp up to the normal business that you'd have had. That's from GB to NI. NI to GB, if you're buying from NI, you should have no concerns. If you're buying directly, it's business as usual.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to, I think, tying off mitigating the risks and looking at what the longer term opportunities for maybe even for investment under the protocol might be. If I could come to you next, Aidan, if that's okay. It's still such a live issue, and I suppose the only way forward is really engagement and keeping on top of the government on, you know, what further easements and facilitations are going to be needed as time goes on.
I suppose you know, a lot of the conversation today has been hugely technical. So I'm going to end on a not technical note, and what's written on the front cover of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is don't panic. Everybody is going through the same thing. The most important thing is to keep talking. Feed into the conversation, because that's how the problems get solved. And so if you're IoD members, make sure you are feeding into the IoD, because at the end of the day, it is that's how we can move forward. We as trade bodies and as the Northern Ireland Business Brexit Working Group are only as strong as the ammunition, as the information that we get from you guys. So keep feeding in.
Yeah, that working group that Aidan really sort of effectively helps chair, I would say chairs effectively, really has been vital, I think, to informing the government and to some extent the EU on kind of step-by-step what business needs to make this work. So before I sort of round up with Anna, because I think there is a question I might put to her on, I haven't seen REX or approved exporter, which Paul raises for quite some time, and actually that sort of status is probably something worth checking. But if I could pass maybe to Pete first, and then Anna. Pete, what are your thoughts, either for businesses that you supply or work, you know, supply to, but also from your own company's perspective and the work for the JCCC going forward?
Yeah, I think what Declan and Aidan have said, I'd agree with. Give it a try. Be patient. You know, the intermediary sector is under pressure, but they're pretty good at working things out, given a bit of time. So stick with it, and you know, keep your fingers crossed.
A lot of fingers, a lot of crosses, everything crossed. And then Anna, finally to you before I close out the session. I don't know, we can probably pick up the question in a bit more detail on the sort of status of REX. I haven't had a question in REX in ages, actually, and that makes me feel almost nostalgic to a certain extent. But Anna, any general sort of top line there and your parting thoughts for the day?
Yes, in terms of REX and approved exporter, again, one of these areas where we find out about it by speaking to HMRC, and the guidance is hopefully coming soon. We do not have the approved exporter status under the deal with the EU. So unlike with other trade agreements, we do not need to be authorized as an approved exporter to use self-certification under this deal, which is a simplification, because obviously we didn't have time to get anyone authorized for an approved exporter. So no REX, no authorized exporter on the UK side for that deal. On the EU side, everything that was required will be required. We're not entirely sure how the EU wants to proceed on approved exporter. The UK will be, as far as I hear, phasing it out in general. So we'll see how that goes. In terms of parting thoughts, I just it's going to be really interesting to see how things go when volumes pick up. I think we're while I obviously will echo what Aidan said about not panicking, I also feel like we're still at the beginning of this process, and a lot will also depend on how the authorities and customs authorities in particular deal with this, whether they treat it as a bit of a partnership where they help companies learn and grow within that process or not. And I really hope they will, because there's a lot of support and help needed for businesses, and I hope that customs authorities can play some of that role, and rather than penalize companies when they make a genuine mistake, try to support them and help them to understand what to do next time.
Great, thanks, Anna. And actually, Paul, thank you. It's probably actually a basis on which we all regularly chat to. And I think just to pick up what in particular Frankie and Declan and Aidan sort of zeroed in on, which is that, I think government does tend to have a tendency, simply by the way, virtue of the way it operates, to sort of, if not work in silos, sort of a lot of this stuff is siphoned off from, indirect taxes held differently from customs, from agri-food, and what we call SBS checks. But, that's not how business works. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to get across to all the various different authorities, both in the UK and in the EU, that this stuff needs to be looked at holistically. So that question actually about approved exporters and RECs, just to maybe get some clarity in terms of written guidance, you've given us some food for thought to take away, even as we speak. Thanks so much to all the speakers. As I said, business sort of attendees and IoD members will get a copy of the recording afterwards. It remains for me to say thank you very much for attending. Anyone who was on the call who was maybe looking for too much fatalism, this was not the point of the call. This is about trying to make this work in practice, because what we want to do is try to preserve trade as much as possible, not only with the EU wherever possible, but particularly I think within the UK, while sort of tying off the risks, mitigating the risks in order to actually avail of those future opportunities down the line. So thanks very much, everyone. Thank you to Chelsea, particularly for helping getting this organized, and see you all anon for the next in these series.